Hi, Zach Vig, University of Maryland. I have a question for Christina. You might have alluded to this in your talk, so forgive me if you did, but did you vary the grain size of the materials, and how did that affect ice formation?
Yeah, now it's on. Okay, cool. That's a really good question. I didn't vary the grain size. Well, so all of the different minerals that we're looking at have a maximum grain size of 40 microns, with the average particle size of between 10 and 20 microns. And it does vary from mineral to mineral, just from differences in how they were milled. But it doesn't seem to really affect any of how, it doesn't seem to affect the similarities between how minerals behave in one experiment versus another. That is something that I'd like to think about for sure, especially because real lunar grains vary quite a lot in their sizes, but also in their mineralogy. And having larger grains that have different minerals as part of the same grain, which is very different from a lot of the simulants, it could definitely affect a lot of how water crystallizes. So yeah, good question. It's something I'm still thinking about.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Hi there, Zach Morris, Howard University and NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. This question's for Eric with the first talk. Actually, one of your first figures in the first talk, so if you can remember all the way back. It seemed to show sort of an asymmetric distribution of the dust lofting or just disturbance. And I was curious because I thought the general consensus was with impacts, you get a point source impact and then a relatively symmetrical wavefront in the subsurface. So would you attribute that to differences in subsurface composition, or does impact angle and direction have an impact on what you found?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So you're talking about that first image of the cold spot. Yeah. I believe that's directionality. I can't think of I can point you to a paper which talks about the influence of the impact angle on the ground shaking, but I think that should be directionality. But like, the sims I did were just this idealized strip, so I wasn't looking at that in any of the modeling I did.
Thank you.
Yep.
Christine Hartzell, University of Maryland. My first question is for Kayla. So you may have said it and I may have missed it, but you were talking about having more activity in the aspherical particles versus the spherical particles. And what did you mean by activity? Like, how did you measure activity?
Yeah, so as I was mentioning, we did image analysis with images of the tubes across time. And what we were looking at there is how much of the image was covered by one color, which corresponds to one size of the whole image at a time. And so when we see that percent coverage is increasing or decreasing, that means those particles are moving in and out of the view of the camera. And so we say more increases, decreases is more active. So that's how we're quantifying that there.
So did you just like take the slope of your percentage coverage line, or?
Sort of. So that actually got to be quite complicated. That's why what I ended up reporting were the variance and standard deviations instead of a slope. So all of those plots were across the entire year's worth of data, and there was an interesting potential delays in the actual response that we're seeing. And so that was easier to capture by eye and say, okay, this behavior, this change in slope is something that's related to this specific event, rather than actually, focusing in the plot and taking the slope of a specific region. So that's what we ended up doing.
All right. Carl Hibbs, AP. I have a question for the last speaker, Jason. Really interesting work. Just want to understand the conclusions of it. So you did this 400 Kelvin. So what are your thoughts on temperature dependency on the ejection and migration of the amino acids that you saw? And can you comment on whether what you're seeing would that be temperature dependent sputtering that's happening? And why do you think that it is a change in the strength of absorption sites that's causing that effect rather than just a sputtering effect in the migration? If that question,
yeah, those are great questions. Yeah, we really don't know at this point what is causing our buried one to show more than the surface non-irradiated sample. Finding efficiency is one avenue we can look at. Essentially these solid solution samples are immersed in this plasma. The plasma for these studies is not accelerated, it's a thermal plasma. So the potential for sputtering is probably really low, but there's a lot of protonation occurring near the surface. So we're not very sure at this point what the degradation products are, but we expect to learn more if we can get a chance to look at the residual gas that's coming off. But yeah, we at this point we don't know, and it really does look like that UV is really or this Lyman alpha produced by this lamp is really the major driver in the photo destruction of the amino acids.
Thanks. Just a comment. Your work temperatures could be relevant to Europa as well, so keep it up.
Oh, thank you. Sure.
Yeah, excuse me. Tom Orlando from Georgia Tech. I have two questions. The first one is from Toshik, I guess. That was a very nice talk. One of the questions I have is, what size are the particles? Are they undergoing endocytosis and being brought into the cell, or are they on the same size order of the cell itself and the particle is messing with the membrane?
So from what I remember is that this is actually something my mentor looked into a little bit, not the endocytosis part, but the particle size. So the idea is that grinding up the particles causes it to be less than 10 micromolar, I believe. And so to determine the actual size is very difficult. So I don't have an answer for that, but the rough estimate is less than 10 micromolar once they're grounded up and placed into the cell, onto the cells. And in terms of the endocytosis, well, I could tell you what the protocol idea is that, so essentially, it technically would be endocytosis because once you have the cells onto the plate and you administer the dust and you do the co-treatment with the inhibitor, that's how the particle is being brought into the cell. It is through endocytosis. But the exact mechanism of how it happens is still yet to be determined. Okay,
I'm going to sneak in another question, which is related. So for the charging, both of the charging talks, I noticed the pressure was 10 to the -6 torr or so. So for surface scientists, that means your surface is covered heavily. And so if that's true, how does that affect the charging? It would be like a coverage of or an organic molecule of water, which is sort of on the surface. Does this matter?
Yes, I'm sure there's definitely going to be an effect that we want to look at less of pressures, like more oriented for the lunar surface, if that was one aspect that we want to go for future work. But yes, that is something that we've also discussed about the type of surface that would form. And it's a great question. Sorry, I don't really have a great answer.
Yeah, I might have a punt at that. I think, for example, in a system that isn't as clean, I guess clean is a contextual thing, but maybe if you're using an oil-backed pump and there's backstreaming, possibly less likely to see a lot of lofting compared to a really nice clean system. So I guess with these experiments, they were both done, I think they were scroll pumps, so not oil-backed. Yep, looks like that was a confirmation, scroll pumps. So yeah, I think in a dirtier system, you'd be less likely to see this happening.
Thank you.
Yeah, Clive Neal, University of Notre Dame. I also have two questions. First one's for Melissa. You showed a very nice model of the tribo charging, and yet they're all spheres, and we know that lunar regolith is not spherical. But how does the actual shape of the particles affect your results? Have you looked into that?
So I haven't specifically looked into that yet. I know that, so for our model that we're using, the tri-bar charging is scaled by the surface area. So if you have like different shaped particles with different surface areas, your tri-bar charging would scale based on that.
Okay. Thank you. And one for Joseph. I had to leave before you got to the end, so you may have covered this, but you're showing the sputtering of the dust, and we get the daylight on the moon, and dust is going up and down. But the observations from the Apollo astronauts that none of the boulders and the samples are covered in dust. So we've got dust going up and down like the Assyrian Empire, and then you've got the observation that where's all the dust on the boulders and on the samples too. So does your modeling account for that?
In terms of, okay, that's interesting. So I was kind of under the impression that if you go back to the transcripts, and this is just what I've read, by no means an expert on those transcripts at all, they talk about dust covering on boulders. So I possibly am misinformed there. I guess it's a question of heights as well and lofting. So I will say that I didn't mention this in my talk. Jose did, I think on Tuesday, Shu did, but there are some observations of light scattering off dust, that lunar horizon glow, that is theorized to be the result of electrostatic.
There's a sketch from Apollo 17 of that.
Yeah.
And the surveyor image, but there was CERN took a sketch, but the surveyor image shows the horizon glow.
Yeah. So on the slides, which is I guess theorized to be a result of the dust lofting.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't comment on I can't comment, sorry, on the dust on the boulders, but there are other things that have been linked, whether or not proven, to electrostatic lofting.
Yeah, it's I think we need to go back.
That sounds good.
Christine Hartzell, UMD again. My question's also for Joseph. So I was wondering why you chose to use a crater, like why your piles of dust were in the crater, and then that plate that has the crater, was that grounded? Was it floating? Was it biased? Like what was going on there?
Yeah, so the crater is inside a little hole as opposed to just dumped on the surface.
Right.
However, the crater was nice because we kind of had our dust, I guess, flush with the top surface. So it's easy to get, the video I showed you was kind of just representative to get an idea of what was going up. So we would usually shoot from a much higher sort of angle. With that crater, we could kind of easily see the dust that had jumped out and landed, and that makes it very easy to count. So my understanding, that's why we did that. It's also when it's in the crater, it's not spreading out as much. So it's a lot easier to identify what has moved. And your second question, sorry, could you repeat that?
Was the plate biased? Like, is there an electric field at the edge of that crater wall, for example, that you're not measuring with your emissive probe?
Yeah, sure. So with that crater, that was a rubber, I think it was rubber sheet sitting on top of Delrin plate, sitting on top of a metal plate that was connected to a power supply but grounded during the charging experiments. So I guess anything developed on the top rubber plate, I can say for the emissive probe, I'm honestly not sure, sorry, but the bottom metal plate was grounded during the experiments.
You were standing a lot longer than.
Hey, I think I have three comments. One, Christina, Schweiley's detection of water ice in the permanent shadow, they show wavelength shifts that, based on some literature results, indicate vapor deposition. So it'd be really great if you guys could measure at the 1.52 and 2 micron bands. So that would be relevant to the existing data. And I just want to comment on the boulder dust. Remote sensing of, ground to ground remote sensing of boulders show there's clear evidence of a very, very thin, optically thin coating of dust on boulders, because the clean surfaces are very different from the boulder surface. Then the last comment is Eric. Wow. Amazing. Yeah.
Paul's first two questions were exactly the ones I was going to ask. So thank you.
Well, I guess I'll go back to Joe again. Getting all the attention here, but
You mentioned at the end of your talk that the Lyman alpha is expected to probably produce a little bit higher yield of the photoelectrons. But what I didn't see was a discussion of the lamp intensity that you use, because even though you're using a higher wavelength, lower energy, the photon flux, how did that compare to the expected lunar photon flux?
Oh, so right. Okay, you're talking about the UV lamp that we use, the 172 nanometer.
Yeah, the Exmer lamps tend to produce,
yeah.
substantially higher fluxes than, for example, a Lyman alpha lamp.
Yeah, so having not used the Lyman alpha lamp, I think that maybe Jason talked about, I'm not sure about the fluxes from those. There's a few on the market. Again, not sure, generally not a lot of power to that. The one that we used, I think was about 8 watts goes into those lamps. I'm honestly not sure how much of that is directly converted into 172 nanometers because we didn't have a flux measurement.
Right. So you can get sort of the measurements of the fluxes from those, and I would suggest that you do that because I'm really curious, like how much the photon flux is going to affect the dust activity.
Yeah,
and
of course.
Sort of the charging timescales, right? Because if you have a lot more photons, then it'd be different.
Yeah, so that's what I'm doing back home, but another 10 minutes, I think. Yeah.
Christine Hartzell, UMD. My question is now for Jose. So you showed this like enhanced patch charge model, and I was wondering what you used to model that.
Specifically the dust sitting on the surface, or are you talking about the surface, the spherical?
The spherical particle, you called it like PCMSP or
Yeah,
something like that.
PCMSP. So, and then could you repeat your question? Sorry.
Oh yeah. Well, what did you use to model that charge across the whole sphere?
So that was done from ISTEC and ASML. They're the ones that did the modeling for that. So they took our parameters that I used an emissive probe, Langmuir probe to get the IV curves and the thermal properties of the plasma. And so we can get a full idea, including the electric field and flux of what's going on in the experiment, sent it over to them, and they used their modeling to create this nice little figure, which is I forget the name of the modeling, sorry, but particle and cell. Thank you. I was like, had the acronym in my head. Yes, the particle and cell PIC code. And so they modeled our experiment. They're trying to just get a full, good, big picture. And one thing that what I didn't mention is, well, it's that they use it. There's still more to do with that. We have a lot of modeling also beyond just that that we will put in the paper. But hopefully that answers your questions.
Yeah, and I had another question. On one of your plots, you had mobility on the y-axis, and I was wondering what that means.
Yes. Okay. So we had a video camera just sitting in front of the chamber, one of the ports, and mobility is determined by looking at the at the brightness of frames in between each frame. Then we would analyze the movement, the changing of the brightness between pixels. So then between those pixels, depending of a boundary based off of the brightness of one of the dust grains, I set a threshold. And so when the change in brightness of a pixel goes beyond that threshold, or it transfers either to or from black to white or white to black, then we counted that as a count. And we normalize that against the total brightness of the frame. And we also restricted it to just the in-focus elements because anything out of focus would cause effects in the counts in our actual, the effects in the counts for the mobility. And then from there, we use that to compare apples to apples across runs. And then that's where we get those error bars from.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I know that we're standing in the way of lunch for most folks there. So I will just jump in here and say, okay, thank you so much for all the speakers. And I also just wanted to use my chance here to personally thank Tashik for your research and talk, because I think a lot of us use lunar regolith simulants and in the lab, and I think few realize sort of the toxicity of them, and your talk really highlights that, and we do need to be very careful wearing the correct PPE, and I don't want to be that guy, but we need to live long lives and have our long careers. And there's a lot of health effects to breathing in that regolith simulant. So thank you for that. And thank you to all the speakers, and let's give them one final round of applause.
Hello? Oh, thank you, Akbar, for your comments. I appreciate it. I just want to make one quick correction. I don't know if the individual that was that asked me the question was still in the room, but I said micromolar. We're not, and he asked about particle size. I apologize. We're not talking about concentration. We're talking about size. So what I meant to say was micrometers in reference to the LHS-1. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.